International trade, the summary of the chapter, amounts to sixth of the total economic activity in the world. IPE, we study, trade, monetary relations, and MNC. Where is going to be the focus? Mostly on rich industrialized countries and global south countries receiving growing attention. Now, let's look at this statement. Again, still in the IPE like a discipline, states are the most important actors, okay? But not as important as in international security studies. Then liberalism and mercantilism. These are two major approaches, and I added structuralism. Okay, I added structuralism. Liberalism, mercantilism, let's look at what those are again. Mercantilism. It's similar to realism, right? In that each state must protect its own interests. Okay? These are the assumptions of mercantilism, similar to realism. Again, same thing. As in liberalism, they emphasize relative power. Then importance of economic transactions lies in their implications for their military power. Okay, military power. Liberalism. Again, generally shares the assumption of anarchy. And same in the first two chapters, we cover this. But they don't see this condition as precluding extensive cooperation to realize common gains. International organizations, building international organizations, institutions, norms, okay, states can mutually benefit from economic exchanges. Okay. This I mentioned. Okay. Liberalism and mercantilism, both theories and ideologies. Okay, both theories and ideologies. In Western economics, liberalism is the dominant approach. Okay, more so in microeconomics than in macroeconomics. In the contemporary era, I think, yes, liberalism is the dominant approach. Right? And liberalism has different variants, right? Washington Consensus, things like that, right? This is how liberalism evolved. Mercantilism, rose, peaked in the 19th century. That's it, right? So that's how liberalism has become a dominant theory, at least in Western economics. At least in Western economics. Particularly in microeconomics perspectives than in macroeconomics perspectives. microeconomics and macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, you can raise some questions about this. I mean, this is a controversial, statement because, I don't see really why particularly for micro, not for macro. Because, macroeconomics, what is macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is economics that concerns financial, monetary, inflation, those issues. That's macroeconomics. So the author implies that macroeconomics, maybe they think that the role of government is more important than in microeconomics. Microeconomics is more related to behaviors of economic actors, right? Companies, consumers, right? Their behaviors. The study of behaviors of different economic actors, including companies, right? That constitutes microeconomics, right? So in his view, those microeconomic phenomena explained better by liberal perspective. That's exactly what he meant. But like I said, most of Washington consensus theories, in contemporary liberal theories, most of these contemporary liberal theories, they find fault with mostly macroeconomic problems in poor countries. So I don't see exactly how this applies reality. So this is a little bit problematic statement. But again, textbook is textbook, right? We'll abide by this statement. Free market and liberal economists. Again, there's a long, tradition of debate between, state functions and free market, right? There's a long tradition of that, right? And just ignore this. Mercantilism. Economics should serve politics. Okay, I mean, you can remember that. The repetition, right? It declined in the 19th century. Balance of trade is important, right? For national interest to have a favorable balance of trade is important. That's mercantilism thinking. To have a favorable, positive balance of trade is very important. For economic sense, okay, but also military sense. That's what mercantilism is talking about, right? If you think like that, U.S. economic policy is really stupid, right? Leaders in the 19th century, like France, right? Their prime goal of state business is to have a favorable balance of trade. Okay, you never ever have to. You should not have a minus balance of trade as a leader. Right? That's mercantilist thinking, because if you have a minus balance of trade, you cannot have a good army. That's the point. Right? Economically dysfunctioning, but militarily also, the country will be in crisis, right? But America, look at America today. The way America prospers is exactly the other way around. America prospers exactly because they have a minus balance of trade, right? So mercantilism in the 19th century and today, very different dynamic, very different philosophy. The way it works, almost 180-degree different. What is protectionism? Protectionism is the discouragement of imports. Protectionism is the discouragement of imports. Right? How do you achieve protectionism? There should be some means, right? There are means to discourage imports. That's where we left off, right? That's where we left off. The means to discourage import. In other words, the protectionist means. What are the protectionist means? Right? The most desirable means to discourage imports or for protectionism is tariffs. Tariff is not a good thing, but if you have to have one, let's have tariffs, then others. Which means that there are other non-tariff barriers also. So there are two kinds of means to discourage imports. One, tariffs, traditional, sometimes desirable means, then non-tariff barriers. Then I ask you to think about what constitutes non-tariff barriers, right? What are non-tariff barriers? Which is NTB, right? And different rounds of trade negotiations, they focused on reducing tariff barriers, and on which they have been successful. Different rounds of trade negotiations, they reduced dramatically tariff barriers. Okay, but not sure how much they were successful in terms of non-tariff barriers reductions. Okay, now tariff or duties, differently called duties, tariffs or duties. Usually it is levied as percentage of goods value, right? How much percentage of the value of certain goods. That's how they levy tariffs or duties. So that's how tariffs restrict imports. Most efficient tool to block imports as a country. Then you collect also money. The government, that's how government collects money. Right? It becomes a part of the revenue, government revenue. This is one of the traditional government functions, right? Levy duties, tariffs on imported foreign items. Traditional, very, very much traditional areas of government business. And transparent, right? It's desirable because it is transparent. Transparent. Everyone knows, right? Everyone knows about tariffs. Okay? So this is exactly what this says. International norms favor tariffs as preferred method of protection. Now, then NTB comes in. NTB, non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers are non-transparent. It's not seen. Intangible. It's not tangible. It's not seen clearly. Non-tariff barriers. There are several kinds. There are several kinds. There's a quota. Okay, quota. Quota is a ceiling on how many goods can be imported. It's a ceiling. Okay? You put the limit on the number of or the amount of, imports. That's quota. Again, this is non-tariff barriers. Most controversial types of NTBs are this. Subsidies. Subsidies. Most controversial, particularly in the context of WTO. Highly controversial. Subsidies. Subsidies are just definition. Payments by a government to a domestic industry. Okay? In other words, when a government gives out money to its own companies, that's subsidies. Okay? That's subsidies. So payments by a government to a domestic industry. The reason being, so that the company lowers production costs. Okay? So that the company lowers production costs. That's how the government protects the industry or the companies from imported competition. Because using those subsidies, those companies or the industry, entire industry can cut the cost. Cut the cost, put lower price on goods, right? So that they have a better competitive edge vis-a-vis imported goods. This violates international trade law. Okay? You should not do that. This is one of the unfair trade practices. If you do that, this is unfair trade practice, giving subsidies. But it's a violation, but many governments do in practice. In practice, many governments do. The industry that is most widespread subsidy practice is agriculture. Agriculture industry is most widespread this unfair subsidies practice. Agriculture sector. Subsidies in the agriculture sector is most widespread. So here, subsidies to farmers have been the major sticking point in the Doha round trade negotiations. Okay, in the Doha round. So agricultural subsidies have been the subject of intense trade conflicts. Okay, under the GATT and also WTO, and even up to the Doha round trade talks. So this is one of the most constant source of trade conflicts. Subsidies in the agriculture sector, most constant source of trade conflicts. Agricultural subsidies. The main conflicting parties, Europe, America. Okay, Europe versus America. And Europe, America on one hand, and developing countries on the other. Because developing countries, they specialize in many agricultural products. They want to export their agricultural products to either Europe or to America. But America, Europe, they protect agricultural industry, right, by giving subsidies to their own farmers so that they can lower production costs, right? Because usually agricultural products from the developing countries, price lower, must be lower, right? So American government, European government, by giving subsidies, they're helping out these farmers in Europe and America to have a competitive edge, right, against products from developing poor countries, which normally is much lower. Like I said, subsidies are also a source of conflict between Europe and America, right? Yes, between Europe and America also. And EU government, the EU government, their agricultural protectionist policy is known as Common Agricultural Policy. Right? Common Agricultural Policy. This is a very famous European agricultural policy, Common Agricultural Policy. Under that banner, the EU supports the farmers, which angers American farmers. America doesn't have this integrated type of subsidies. Europe has it, EU has it, which is CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, CAP. The EU has CAP. America doesn't have it. So America has a lot of complaints against CAP. Subsidies between Europe and America, subsidies are not limited to agricultural sector. Even in high technology industries, the EU, they give subsidies to high-tech related industries. Right? For instance, defense industry. The EU, again, America is upset about EU giving subsidies to these like defense industries, right? So not limited to the agriculture industry. So that's subsidies. Number 3, regulations. Regulations or restrictions. How regulations could serve as subsidies, could serve as non-tariff barriers, NTB. What this means is that there are much more sophisticated types of NTBs. These are regulations, domestic regulations. The way it works is that you don't openly block imports, okay? But you can argue that certain imported goods violate some environmental or labor regulations. So based on that, some governments in the industrialized countries put some limitation on certain imported goods based on environmental regulations or labor regulations. me to elaborate on it? How environmental regulations restrict imports? I want to ask questions. Kimi-chan, how would environmental regulations limit imports? Give us some details. How would that work?
I think like trying to produce goods that have low carbon emissions. Affect like what kind of products are imported in the country.
Exactly, exactly, right. It's the same products, same goods, okay? But you look into the goods, okay? According to some rich countries, okay? You import goods from poor countries, okay? No problem with it. You know, at the outside, seen from outside, everything looks okay. But you look into it, but you analyze the components of these goods from poor countries. Then the outcome of your analysis suggests that these components of these goods are really, horrible products in terms of environmental regulations, environmental quality. So this government comes out and saying, well, looks good from the outside, but we can't import this. We can't. We can't import this because we care about the environment. That's what you're trying to say, right? This is how environmental regulations limit imports. Labor regulation, same goes. Like for instance, again, if you analyze the components of these goods, then you use a certain goods like exploiting child labor. Then you have to say, no, we can't import. It's a good one, but we can't import. That's how labor regulations limit imports. This is one of non-tariff barriers. Then, finally, culture. Culture can also be non-tariff barriers. Culture. Again, this is even more sophisticated than regulations. Much more sophisticated types of NTBs, right? But the impact, enormous. Okay? Cultural NTB, the impact of cultural NTB, enormous. Okay, sophisticated, but the outcome should be enormous. Like for instance, when Americans import Japanese cars, right? Japanese cars cheaper, better, quieter, right? Everything better than American cars, right? But you appealing to the American citizens, okay? So that, buy American cars. Appealing to American nationalism, okay? This happens a lot in many different countries. This is again NTB. Kim Hyun-min. Yes. According to the textbook, is protectionism always negative? Or protectionism has both negative and positive effects on economy? Yes. Yes, you're right. Protectionism has both positive and negative impacts on economy. Temporary protectionism. temporary protectionism can have a stabilizing effect under certain conditions. I'm just reading from the text. Temporary protectionism can have a stabilizing effect. Stabilizing effect. Now, GATT. Let's talk about GATT and WTO. The difference between GATT and WTO. Okay, the difference between GATT and WTO. GATT was born after ITO, right? Was not born, right? GATT was established instead. Then GATT is a negotiating framework than an institution. Okay, GATT is a negotiating forum. It is not a real administrative institution. Okay, GATT is a negotiating forum or negotiating framework. And so that their institution is weak. Okay, small staff, right? The headquarters were in Geneva, Switzerland, but small office, small secretariat. Some trade dispute functions. Okay, trade dispute, arbitration. Okay? Some trade dispute, arbitration. But no enforcement mechanism. Okay? GATT did not have enforcement mechanism. Okay? They were just helping arbitrate trade disputes, but no enforcement decisions can come down from it. Okay? That's what GATT is all about. Then WTO, right, came around. When did GATT become WTO? 1995. 1995, GATT became WTO. In terms of the agenda, okay, GATT, in terms of the agenda, GATT addressed mostly manufactured goods trade. Okay? In terms of the agenda, GATT addressed mostly manufactured goods trade negotiation. That's the most important function of GATT. Okay? Reducing barriers for manufactured goods. Then WTO went ahead to include broader issues, including trade in services. Okay, WTO, trade in services. Trade in intellectual property. Trade in intellectual property rights. These are new agendas under the WTO. Right? Agricultural goods, both. Okay, GATT, WTO, agricultural trade negotiation, both. WTO has, unlike unlike the GATT, had some powers of enforcement. Again, I'm trying to paraphrase from the textbook. Some powers of enforcement. Okay? Some powers of enforcement. And WTO is now a real institution. Okay? Has a huge international bureaucracy. The staff member of about 600 people. How many members? As of 2012, 155 member countries. 155 member countries. Now, trade negotiations. Okay, there are several rounds of trade negotiations. Right? There are several rounds of different trade negotiations. Let's list them first. Okay, let's list the different rounds of trade negotiations and the characteristics of different rounds of trade negotiations. Number one, we had Kennedy round. Kennedy round. In the 1960s. Kennedy round in the 1960s. Then we had Tokyo round. Tokyo round, 1970s. 1980s, most of 1980s and up until the mid-1990s, we had Uruguay round. Uruguay round. This is the end of GATT. Okay? Then we enter WTO system after 1995. Kennedy round, the focus was on the European integration. The Tokyo round, 70s. The oil price crisis, OPEC oil price crisis. OPEC oil price crisis. Then Japanese automobile exports. That's the focus. The Uruguay round. Uruguay round. The two things. America was pressuring Europe to reduce agricultural subsidies. That's one of the main discussions. America pressuring European countries to reduce agricultural subsidies. On the other hand, America was pressuring developing countries to protect intellectual property rights. That's another type of discussion. Uruguay round. Then agricultural trade issues. Okay, one of the hot topics in the Uruguay round. Now, WTO was founded 1995. My question, after WTO was founded, new round of trade negotiations began when? As late as when? 2001. Okay, after 6 years absence. As late as 2001, another round of trade negotiations began. Okay? They tried to jumpstart the new round, but it failed, right? Most famous meeting, WTO meeting, was Seattle meeting, 1999, where different NGOs, people took to streets, right, demonstrating against WTO meetings, right? That's how WTO actually began, right? Very rough, right? Got off to a very rough start, WTO. So that 2001, they finally got down to having official new round of trade negotiation. It was called Doha round, because that meeting was in Doha, Qatar. So, 2001, that's how Doha round began, right? And topics and discussions in the Doha round. What issues mostly? Again, the most difficult issue, blocking trade improvement in the Doha round, is still agricultural issue. Okay, still agricultural issue. So, page 297. 297, first paragraph at the end. The main obstacle remains, still in the Doha round, the main obstacle remains the resistance of the industrial West to cut agricultural subsidies as demanded by countries in the global South. This is the biggest obstacle still in the Doha round. Okay? Although we have all other different issues, right? Services issue, intellectual property rights issue. Okay, these are new issues in the Doha round. Okay. Now, at the end of WTO, 2001, 2012 Doha round, okay, was run, but it didn't get anywhere. Didn't get anywhere. Where did Doha round go after that? Where is Doha round going today? Naturally, this leads us to 298, to next subtopic, which is bilateral regional agreements. Not failure, not abject failure, but wishy-washy, delay in Doha round lead us to FTA negotiations. FTA negotiations. WTO is multilateral trade negotiations. You have to remember that, multilateral. WTO is multilateral track, okay? It is a consensus type of track. And again, naturally difficult to have an outcome, right? So, while this multilateral track is being delayed, we have this more bilateral or regional track began. The implication of regional bilateral FTA track, it's early to judge, but clearly regional bilateral FTAs are delaying the development of multilateral trade negotiations, have a bad impact on multilateral trade negotiations. So this is what it says. Bilateral trade agreements and regional trade agreements. Since when exactly, we don't know, but roughly by the middle of 2000s, we begin to see the signing of bilateral free trade agreements, okay, and much more regional free trade FTAs, bilateral FTAs, regional FTAs. Bilateral FTAs is clearly, FTA, free trade agreement between two countries, okay, between two countries. We have many, including Quotas FTA, U.S. ROC FTA, which was signed 2011, right? We had a raising debate on that FTA agreement with the United States. Who benefits more, right? America benefits more, or Korea benefits more. But bilateral FTA agreements and regional FTA agreements if you want to get to the conclusion first, go to 302, page 302. Right above the section cartels, the paragraph just above a new subsection cartel, that paragraph explains the impact of bilateral, regional FTAs on multilateral free trade. So you might want to read that carefully. This is the conclusion. May I read maybe a couple of sentences? If regional free trade areas, such as now exists in Europe and North America, gain strength and new ones arise, the WTO may be weakened. This is the conclusion. And this is exactly where we are going at the moment. The more that states meet the political requirements of economic growth through bilateral regional agreements, the less they may depend on the worldwide agreements developed through the WTO. Furthermore, the overlap of WTO rules and regional agreements can create confusion. Now, so this is the conclusion in advance. Let me tell you. Lowering barriers among countries and signing some, free trade areas. There are different kinds. Okay. Probably the least developed type of free trade agreements are FTA. Free trade agreements. Then you have customs union. Then you have common market. Okay, free trade agreement, customs union, common market. The difference? Free trade areas. Okay. By signing free trade agreements and forming free trade area, that means you reduce trade barriers and adopt a common tariff toward states, okay, that are non-member states. That's free trade areas. Okay, that's free trade areas. And free trade area, this, I mean, known as customs union, sorry, customs union also, right? Free trade area, customs union, same thing, right? Then from customs union, okay, from customs union to become a common market, okay, customs union to common market, you need additional one more component, which is common monetary policy. Common monetary policy. Then you become a common market. Then from common market to union, like in the European Union. Maybe we'll get to this in chapter 10, just a little bit next week. To become a union, you need common foreign policy, right? Common social policy. Then it becomes a union. Right? Now then, examples of regional free trade agreements. Regional free trade areas. Examples. I can ask some questions. Kim Hyun-min? I think you said, right? 노경민. 노경민. NAFTA, you know NAFTA, right? Who are the members of NAFTA?
US, Canada, and Mexico.
Okay, US, Canada, Mexico. When was it signed? 1994. North American Free Trade Agreement, right? It was signed 1994. This textbook describes some different views of different countries on how NAFTA is working, right? U.S. views on NAFTA, the role of Mexico, then also Mexicans' view on the NAFTA. What is it? Some U.S. citizens, okay, some U.S. citizens, they oppose NAFTA, right? Why?
They think that wage is too low, and otherwise the law about labor is not really right.
Which country's labor? Okay, so you have a differential in labor costs, right? Differential in labor costs in Mexico and in the United States. Clearly, Mexico, you have a lower labor cost, right? So Americans think that this labor cost, lower labor costs in Mexico would draw down U.S. labor standards. Okay, this is how the U.S. views on the NAFTA. The problems of NAFTA, negative view on NAFTA. And how about Mexicans? Mexicans' view on NAFTA. What are the bad, negative sides of NAFTA in terms of environmental regulations?
Their environmental law, which criticize.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Everything is really working.
Okay. The regulation, environmental regulations in Mexico must be much more relaxed than in the United States. So the barriers between the U.S. and Mexico is get rid of. When it is get rid of, probably that could be an invitation for U.S. companies, U.S. corporations. They could bring those pollutant materials, okay, across the border, then put them on the Mexican side. Okay, that's Mexicans' worries about the impact of NAFTA free trade agreements. But over many 15 years, at the moment, this is what this textbook concludes. Over 15 years, neither the great benefits, okay, but nor the disasters. Okay, just not going great, but not much of disastrous, outcomes from NAFTA. Now, what regional free trade agreement we have in the North American and South American area? In other words, Western Hemisphere. What kind of regional free trade agreement in the Western Hemisphere that encompass both North America, South America, right? Both North America, South America, like the entire Western Hemisphere wide regional free trade agreement. That is FTAA. FTAA, right? The entire Western Hemisphere wide regional free trade agreement, FTAA. Does it exist now? No, not yet. Okay, a lot of talking, but not yet exist. Okay, a lot of talking, still talking. Again, the reason FTAA has not been born yet is there are different views. There are different views. Okay, the U.S., their demand on South American countries, right? That is blocking, right? The signing of FTAA. What does the U.S. want? What the U.S. wants from these, South American countries is that the same thing. Those requirements for labor and environmental standards, right? America has much higher labor and environmental standards, right? That those South American countries could not meet those U.S. demands, okay, on labor and environmental grounds. So that's how FTAA is being delayed. Now, Asia, in this part of the world, the region where we are living, do we have free trade area? We have bilateral free trade agreements. We have many in this region, but we don't have a region-wide free trade agreement yet in this region, in the Asian region. We have sub-regional FTAs, like ASEAN. Okay, ASEAN is, I think ASEAN that they passed customs union. They're approaching common market, ASEAN, right? ASEAN is approaching common market. It's a huge contrast to Northeast Asian region. ASEAN is Southeast Asian region. Okay, Northeast Asian region. What is it like? Northeast Asian region. We have China, Korea, Japan. That's it. Just independent, 3 entities. That's it. No, we don't even have free trade agreement between these 3 countries. China, Korea, Japan, we don't even have FTAs, bilateral FTAs. You know, read this. The first sentence, it says, efforts to create a free trade area in Asia began in the 80s, but moved very slowly. Regional free trade agreements in Asia, particularly slow, than in Europe, obviously, than in Latin America, than in any other region. The reason behind it is well illustrated in this book. The reason behind why Asia is disintegrated. Geographical region. Asian continent, we have lots of islands. Asian countries are separated by islands and seas, unlike in Europe, unlike in Latin America. So that sort of blocks, naturally, geographically blocks integration in this region. That's one reason. Second, we have a wide variety of different economies here. China still struggling, right? Japan and Korea. Japan clearly much more advanced. Korea in between. So when economic gaps are this huge, right? Difficult to sign FTA, free trade agreement. I mean, Mexico signed one with the US and Canada. But here, China signing an FTA with Korea, it's under discussion, but takes a lot of time. China signing an FTA with Japan, right? Takes a lot of time. Then, linking Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia. How about that? Right? Linking Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia. So-called Asia-wide regional FTA. According to this book, this region-wide Asia FTA is under discussion, is under serious discussion, right? Is under serious discussion. Is the United States invited? No. No. This Asian-wide free trade, regional free trade agreement excludes the United States. That's one very important particular characteristic. China, ASEAN, they have already won. China, ASEAN, free trade agreement, right? China, ASEAN. But we don't have ASEAN, China, Korea, Japan, all of them, right? So, this is important. Now, cartel. Let's get to cartel. Cartel. Cartel is, by definition, association of either producers or consumers. Either producers or consumers. The rationale behind cartel is to manipulate prices. manipulate prices. Most important cartel, most famous cartel, OPEC. Okay, most outstanding producer cartel. Producer cartel is OPEC, right? Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. 박민정? Yes, OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Not knowing when it was established, maybe in the 60s. OPEC was first founded, I think 64. 64, right? OPEC was founded. Then OPEC, do they have monopoly on oil export? No, it's not monopoly. It's kind of oligopoly. Okay, it's not 100%. Okay, domination. What market portion? OPEC market portion of the entire oil market? About 40%. OPEC members account for 40% of the entire oil market. Right? It comes and down. Sometimes higher than 40%, sometimes lower than 40%, but on the average, 40%. Can you tell us, 박민정, can you tell us how this cartel, OPEC, work? How does this work as a cartel?
Well, they have other headquarters in Austria, and they hold negotiations.
Among whom? Among OPEC members, right?
Yeah.
OPEC members. What are the responsibilities of OPEC members as a cartel member? Why is it a cartel? The functioning definition of cartel is that there must be some duties, right, of OPEC member countries. What should they do? They are given quota, right? Can they produce as much they want? No. No, right? OPEC members, they are given limited amount of oil production, okay, set by the OPEC. Why? What happens if all the oil producing countries want to produce at maximum, right? Without any limitation from the top, then all the oil exporting countries produce at maximum, then the market will crash, right? The market will crash because it'll become an overproduction. So OPEC is to limit those overproduction by giving quota, setting quota for member countries. That's the most important function of OPEC, which is to manipulate prices. That's how they manipulate prices, by giving quota to individual countries. That's how they manipulate price. That's why it is cartel. That's why it is cartel, right? Most important function of OPEC. What's the role of Saudi? Saudi plays a special role, right? Saudi plays a special role. Saudi, again, member, but very special member. Saudi Arabia is a very special member, especially in the sense that they have the ability to produce the most. Saudi, number one producer. So Saudi can help out the OPEC in terms of adjusting prices, okay, by adding more volumes of oil on the market, right? So Saudi has a special role as a member. Now, what is consumer cartel? Do we have consumer cartel? We have IEA. We have IEA, Consumer Cartel. Right? What's the most important function of IEA? IEA, their most important function is coordinate energy policies of consuming countries. Okay? Prepare for energy crisis. IEA, they prepare for energy crisis through oil stockpiles. So IEA, they give orders to specific member countries to maintain how much volume of oil stockpiles, okay, in crisis situations. That's the most important role of IEA. Now, industries. Let's get it over with, all of the rest of subsection. Industries and interest groups. Industries and interest groups. This section looks at several industries that are the subject of trade negotiations. Okay, most important industry, agriculture industry, in terms of trade negotiations. We repeated this, right, again and again. So I don't want to repeat that again. But second most important industry in terms of trade negotiation is textile industry, clothing industry. Clothing industry is a very interesting industry, particularly in the contemporary era, in the sense that the most outstanding feature of the textile industry currently is that China began dominating this industry. Okay, China began dominating this industry. China produces so much, okay, textile and clothing products, so that who suffers? The country that suffers because of this Chinese domination of the clothing industry. Those countries are Pakistan, Bangladesh. Okay, they suffer. They lose competitive edge against Chinese textile industry. Okay. So this says that in 2005, European Union and the United States, they reached an agreement with China to impose some textile quota, okay, on China, on the Chinese textile industry, okay, so that these poor countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, these countries, they take back some of the market share from the Chinese textile industry. This is how the market, this industry is going. Intellectual property rights industry. Intellectual property rights industry. And services industry. Okay, these are two emerging industries in trade negotiations. what is two industries, intellectual property rights and services industry. What these two industries have in common is that America has a comparative advantage. Okay, so that America imposes some right rules, right? So that, like for instance, intellectual property rights, we have newly formed international organizations, okay, that are to govern intellectual property rights issues, right? This international organization is WIPO. WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, right? And under the leadership of WIPO, the new multilateral agreement was signed on intellectual property rights, which is TRIPS. TRIPS, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. TRIPS. Okay, so most, including America, most industrialized countries, they prefer to use TRIPS rules. TRIPS rules. They push for these TRIPS rules, okay, to protect their property rights. TRIPS rules. And services industry, same thing, right? And finally, arms industry. This is quite an interesting section. Arms industry. Who is the biggest arms seller in the world today? America. America is the biggest weapons seller. Okay. And who are the the consumers? The biggest consumers, Middle East countries. The biggest consumers, Middle East countries. So top seller, America. Second seller, Russia. They don't mention Russia, but Russia comes second. Russia, America, they compete to like open these Middle Eastern, particularly Middle Eastern and others, poor countries, weapons market. Okay? China is a rising consumer. China buys lots of weapons. Okay? But not from America, but from Russia. China buys a lot of weapons from Russia. Okay? All kinds of weapons, from aircrafts to everything. They have purchased weapons from Russia. But the difference is, they don't mention that here, the recent trend is that China is rapidly becoming a net exporter rather than importer. That's a more recent trend. In other words, China purchased a lot of weapons from Russia, okay? But they dissected all these Russian weapons, then they reverse engineered, okay? Then reassemble these all kinds of different weapons. They created their own weapons. And now China can sell those weapons to poor countries. So China is becoming a seller in the arms market. Now, enforcement of trade. Enforcement of trade, last section. Then we'll go home. Last section. Now, again, enforcement of international law is difficult, right? Enforcement of international law, international rules and regulations is difficult. Then how do we enforce trade rules? That's the question here. How do we enforce trade rules, right? In general, international rules are enforced by reciprocity, right? Reciprocity, tit for tat, right? If you raise tariffs, I raise tariffs. That's how you lower tariffs, right? That's how trade rules are maintained, reciprocity. So that is emphasized here. But the only downside to this reciprocity in terms of trade rules is the danger of trade war. Okay, danger of trade war. In other words, race to the bottom. Okay, that's one danger, one downside. Second downside is that difficulty of defining what constitutes a fair trade, fairness. There's a difficulty. There's a difficulty of deciding on what constitutes fair, right? And right. And every trade rule has component of retaliation. This is important. Retaliation. Retaliation, right? If you dump certain products, okay, they get retaliated. Okay? American trade law, which is known as Super 301, right, gives free hand to the US government. When certain countries dump their products in the US market, 301, right, gives certain rights to the US government to retaliate against this dumping. Okay? So retaliation is important. Retaliation is part of reciprocity. So American trade law has it, WTO rules have it. Under the WTO, retaliation is allowed. Okay, that's reciprocity. Now, finally, do you remember international cooperation? International cooperation, in general, is assisted by certain type of political structure, which is known as hegemony. Do you remember we had that? Yes. Hegemony assists in fulfilling international cooperation. Same goes for trade. Last paragraph. Trade cooperation is easier to achieve under hegemony. Hegemony is a particular type of political structure, right? Yes. So trade, free trade, in other words, free trade or trade cooperation is easier to achieve under hegemony. Let's conclude by reading the last 3 sentences, why that is, why hegemony assists. Overall, despite some loss of state sovereignty as a result of growing interdependence, these efforts have benefited participating states. Stable political rules governing trade allow states to realize the great economic gains that can result from international exchange. What happens after hegemony? Right? That's my question. What happens after hegemony? How could we achieve trade cooperation after hegemony? When American-US hegemony gone, how do we achieve trade cooperation. The last resort, after hegemony. This textbook says, what? When US hegemony is gone, trade cooperation is achieved when we have good institutions. Good institutions. Only good institutions can replace particular political structure, such as US hegemony. But currently, US hegemony is being replaced by multipolar war, right? So the only thing we can rely on is not hegemony, but institutions and international organizations. That way we can achieve free trade, not protectionism. Thank you very much. Friday, we'll get to finance, chapter 9.